All right, good afternoon, and thanks everybody for joining us online. We've got April Dunnam here today. She's a Microsoft MVP who's really good at PowerApps. We call her the Queen of PowerApps and the Liberator of Creativity, so it's quite a privilege to have her here with us today. She's going to be talking about how we can extend PowerApps with Flow, and with that, I'll go ahead and hand it over to her.
Hey, thanks. Yeah, and thanks again for having me speak at your group again. I think last time I spoke was with Melissa Hubbard, so appreciate you having me back. All right, so just a little bit about me. My name, like you said, is April Dunnam. I am a Microsoft MVP in the business app space, so PowerApps and Flow. I'm a partner and lead consultant at a company called ThriveFast. We're a Microsoft partner and build a lot of solutions with PowerApps and Flow and SharePoint. I am an active blogger and speaker. You can follow me on my blog, sharepointsiren.com, and on Twitter at April Dunnam. And I do run the Oklahoma PowerApps and Flow user group. So if you ever make it down to Oklahoma and check that out, that would be awesome. And I'm a concert junkie and karaoke queen. So just a little bit about me there. All right, so just diving right into key objectives for this talk. I'm going to do a brief overview of what PowerApps and Flow are. And then we're really going to focus on the integration story between the two tools. I have 4 specific integration ideas, demos that hopefully will get your brain going and kickstarted to think about the different integration possibilities between PowerApps and Flow for your business. All right, so first, what is PowerApps? PowerApps is a rapid application development tool that allows you to build business apps fast. With PowerApps, you can connect to over 200 different services. So of course, being part of Office 365, that means connecting to SharePoint and all the dynamics and all those tools, but also other tools like social media, like Twitter, and various other systems that you can connect to and use within PowerApps. You also have the ability to build and use your own custom connectors. So if you have some kind of internal system which has an API, you can build a custom connector so that you can interact with that data in PowerApps. And there is an on-premise data gateway. So if you have on-prem data that you want to talk to, you can configure that and use that data in your PowerApps as well. There's a big SharePoint piece with PowerApps, so you can embed these PowerApps forms and apps in your SharePoint and Teams site. And you can customize your SharePoint list forms with PowerApps. So kind of similar, if any of you come from an InfoPath background, how you could click customize this list in InfoPath, it's kind of the same thing for Office 365. You can customize in PowerApps now. And PowerApps has some advanced capability, such as being able to upload files, has camera control, barcode scanning capabilities, and all of that. So how does it work? I like to describe PowerApps as if Excel and PowerPoint had a baby, that would be PowerApps. So that's because the user interface of PowerApps, which we'll see in a bit, is very PowerPoint-esque, very simple, drag and drop. But the kind of, I guess, code behind piece of it is very Excel-like. So there's no actual code base for PowerApps. Anything that you need to do is going to be a function that you write. So just to give you a visual of how similar it is to Excel in terms of the functions, this graph shows you everything in green. These are Excel functions that you can also use within PowerApps. So your now, is numeric, average, concatenate, all that kind of stuff you can use within PowerApps. All right, so now that we have a general good feel for what PowerApps is, let's talk about Flow. So Flow is an automation tool, part of Office 365. And it allows you to work less and do more. So those same 200 plus data sources that we could connect to and use in PowerApps, we can connect to and use within Flow as well. Flow is great for streamlining approvals. There's also built-in input form kind of capability with Flow. You can use a Flow button and it can ask you for information, maybe to take a picture or put in some particular information, and the workflow can run and execute something based off of that information. And of course, with Flow, it can help bring additional functionality to your Microsoft Forms and PowerApps that you built. All right, so now the important part, the integration story. So PowerApps and Flow, they meet. Any Pac-Man fans out there? That's where I stole this from. All right, so do more with Flow with PowerApps. So from PowerApps itself, you can start a flow and pass parameters to that flow and return data from the flow back to your Power App. So one idea that you might use this for is if there's some other kind of one of those external systems I talked about that has an API, you can execute a flow from your Power App, have the flow call the API, and return the data to use and consume within your Power App. So if there's something you can't do natively in Power Apps, Flow is a great augment of that to kind of extend your Power Apps. All right, now diving into the integration stories. You get a flow, everyone gets a flow. So integration number one, role-based security. So I've been working with, back in the days, InfoPath and forms in general, particularly with SharePoint, for quite a bit. And one of the most common things that I've seen people do or need within that is role-based security in their apps. So, you have a certain screen or button or fields that you want to lock down to a specific group of people. We can handle this in Power Apps with a little help from Flow. So we can lock down certain sections of our app. We can call a flow on start of our app that will actually look at the permissions from a SharePoint security group that we already have out there and check if the current logged in user of the app is in that SharePoint group. And if so, display the content. And there's a great blog post out there already on this that Geetha wrote on the Microsoft Flow blog that has step-by-step directions on how to do this. But I'm going to walk you through a demo quickly to show you how this is set up. So jumping into Power Apps, I have a customer management app for my business. And we have different screens where we can add and manage customers, but there's a particular section of this app which allows for mass importing of data, and I want to lock that down so only certain people that I designate as admins can have access to that. And I'm controlling the access to that particular screen with this admin login button. So what I want to happen is if I'm a member, an admin in the SharePoint group that I have designated, I want this button to show. Otherwise, that button doesn't even show and we can't get to the admin section of this particular app. So let's look from the Power App side of things. Well, let's jump to the flow first. So how do we set up a flow to check for a SharePoint group and pass that data, whether that person's in that group, back to Power Apps? So if you go to flow.microsoft.com, that will take you to the Flow portal. And on the left-hand side here, if you click My Flows, this will take you to where all of your flows are built. So I've already went through and built this particular flow. Awesome, I have some errors there. I'm going to dismiss that for now. And one of these flows is the role-based security flow. And the great thing I like about this is it has these handy icons, so I can easily tell what the trigger of this flow is. So that's the Power App icon, so I know that this flow is being called from Power Apps. So if I put this flow in edit mode, we'll see that the trigger is Power Apps. And I'm just, from the start, defining a couple variables in Power Apps. So one is a yes, no, a Boolean to populate if this is an admin or not. And then I'm getting the group information and putting that in a string variable for everyone that's in this SharePoint group. So to actually pull the information from the SharePoint group, we're going to insert a action that's an HTTP request from SharePoint. So if we add an action here and go to SharePoint, we can filter the results down. You'll see one of these actions is send an HTTP request to SharePoint. So that's what we're using here. And all this action is going to ask you for is the address for where this group, security group, is on SharePoint. So in my case, it's in my sales portal. And for the method for this, we're just going to use a get. And this is the URI that we're going to pass in. So it's just a REST call, and we're getting the group by the ID. So to find that particular ID, you could go to your SharePoint group. And I'll just go there real quick so you can walk through and see how you get the ID. If we go into our permissions in our SharePoint site, all right, in advanced permission settings, we'll find that group in question. Oh, and great, it's gonna have me log in here. While I'm logging in, any questions so far? Are we doing good? Okay, I'll take that as a no. All right, so the group that I want to check is this sales owners group. So if I click within that group and look at the URL up here, this membership group ID is the ID that I want to use in my flow. So I just grab that ahead of time and paste that in here. And I like using the ID because if you ever change the group name, the ID always stays the same. So it's a safe bet to use the get by ID. And then for this big long URI, we're saying filter it where the email equals the email that we're going to pass in from PowerApps. So to pass in something from PowerApps, you see this option here to ask in PowerApps. So just insert one of those, and that'll give us a variable that we can pass in from PowerApps to populate this data, right? So now we're going to do a set variable action. So this user group info variable we defined, we're setting that to the results of our HTTP request here. Now this is a condition in Flow. So we're saying if the results of that is 0, that means this person is not in that group. So we're going to set, so if it's not 0, they're not in the group. They are in the group, so set the admin to true. If it is 0, they're not, so set the admin to false. And then all we're doing is putting that data back into PowerApps. So we have an admin field, and we're putting in that yes or no value. All right, let's go back to PowerApps. So I'm going to open this app in edit mode, and we'll see how we can call this flow from our app and return the result to show or hide that button. Okay. Cool. So no questions so far. That's good. All right, so the PowerApp's going to load, and in PowerApps itself, PowerApps is broken out into different screens. So I have this landing screen here. There's a screen for our customer management and all these other different screens. So where my button is, my admin button that I want to restrict, that's where I need to do this code to call the flow. So if I go to my app on visible, you'll see that I'm setting a variable is admin to false. Okay. And that's being set here. So on my button, that's where I'm checking to see, I'm actually running my flow from here, validating if this person is an admin or not, and if so, navigating, setting that value to true so that I can navigate to that page. So to call a flow from a Power App, let's do that first. I'm going to insert a new button because one bit of warning when you're working with flows in Power Apps. So if I wanted to add a flow from here, and I already have all of this code in here, right, in this on select. So to call a flow, you have to go to action and flows. And this will populate down here on the right-hand side a list of all of the flows that are associated with the Power Apps trigger. So I would select the one that I want to use from this list. And when you do, it populates that into your formula bar here. But what it does, and I copied the formula so I'm safe, I'll just show you. It will delete everything that you had in the formula bar when you do that. So just word of caution there, I learned that the hard way when I started to do this, that it is going to do that. So copy whatever you have in there first and get your flow associated, and then paste that back in. So what I'm doing here is I'm setting the user group info variable and calling the flow itself. So here's my flow call. The name is role-based security, and you just do a .run to execute the flow. And then I'm passing in the email of the current logged in user, so the flow that we just looked at can check that and see if that email is in that group or not, and send us back the message if it is an admin. So pretty cool scenario there for doing role-based security in your app. And again, there is a post here on the Flow community blog that walks you step by step exactly how to do this. So definitely, if this is something of interest to you, check out this blog post here. And I can share out these slides so you have this to reference later on. All right, so being conscious of time, moving on. The next integration idea, creating a PDF from PowerApps data using Flow. So another common thing that I get for people want to do in PowerApps is print the data. Now, right now, there's not a way to natively print. There's not a print preview or print functionality built into PowerApps natively yet. I will say out on the PowerApps ideas forum, this is a highly requested idea. And if it's something that you want in your PowerApps, they're actually actively taking feedback. It's in a started stage, and they have a survey out there, which you can take and give them feedback on what you want printing wise for PowerApps. So definitely encourage you to be active on the idea forum and that survey so that they can get this feature out there. But in the meantime, kind of a workaround that you can do to print your PowerApps data is to use an HTML control in your PowerApps to format the data of your app as HTML, and then call a flow, which will then convert that HTML to a PDF so that you can open that up and print it. So a little bit of a convoluted process, but it gets you a nice, clean, printable PDF of your PowerApps data. So let's walk through how to do this scenario here. So on this same app that I have for the customer management, if I go to add customer, you'll see that I have, let's go back here. I'll go to manage customers and I'll click on a particular customer. All right, so I have this data about one of my customers and I need this in a printable format so I can print it. In here, in my app itself, I just have this little download button. So what this button is doing is it's going to call the flow that will take the HTML and print it out. So first, let's look at how we get the HTML piece to work. So I'm going to go back to the edit mode of my app, and that is in the add customer screen. So we have all this data, and it's just a form control where the data is stored. But in here, what I did is I have a hidden HTML text control. So if you want to use one of these, you go to the Insert tab and Text, and that's the HTML text option here. So insert one of those, and you'll just make it kind of hidden, like not visible in your app, but you'll populate the data with the HTML that you want. So in the HTML text property of this, if I kind of expand this out here, I have pretty straightforward HTML, right? I just want a header that says customer data, and I have divs and I'm pulling in, so I have a heading for the name, and I'm just pulling in the data from my form here. So let's see, data card value 12, that's the first name here, full name. So that's this value here. So something when you're working with forms in PowerApps, if you haven't did that before, everything is stored in a data card. And in that data card, you have your label for what this field is, and then you have the physical value, and you have visible and error message properties. So you need to get the physical value of your control, and that's going to be this data card value, whatever number property. So I'm just passing those in and filling that out in my HTML for each of these controls and properties on this page. So again, pretty straightforward HTML. We can make it nicer and hard code some CSS and all that, but I just kept it simple for this case. Right, so now we want to call a flow which will actually take that HTML and export it to a PDF for us. So let me go back to my app and I'll make that button show because you can only get to it from a current customer. There we go. So on this button, we're just doing the same thing here. So I already have a flow created, and it's called HTML to PDF. So after we download this and run the flow, I want to return back to the user the link of the file so they can open it and then print it. So what I'm doing here is just setting a variable in PowerApps called file link. And then within that variable, I'm running my flow, and I'm passing into my flow the HTML text that I just defined, and the full name of the person, contact info, because that's the name of the file is going to be when I store it, in this case, in SharePoint. And then I'm getting the file link from the flow and passing that into my variable. So pretty straightforward from the PowerApps side. Now let's take a look at the flow.
Hey, April.
Yes.
Hey, we have a question from Hisa watching online. He says, did you compose the HTML text yourself, or is it generated when you add the HTML text control?
That's a great question. You have to do this yourself. So yeah, I mean, if you don't know HTML, it is going to be a little bit of a pain. So I happen to know HTML, so it was not that bad for me. But yes, you will have to compose this yourself. That's a great question. And there are tools out there, I will say, to kind of help spit out HTML for you. And you can kind of just fill it in with the properties from your Power App itself. So if you just Google like HTML generator tools, you'll find some out there. And so that's a great place to get started if you're not as familiar with HTML. All right, so back to the flow side of things. Let's take a look at my HTML to PDF flow, put that in edit mode. So again, for this one, the trigger is PowerApps, so I'm executing it from my app. And then you'll see these OneDrive kind of things. So one is create file. So natively right now with SharePoint, there's not a way to create like an HTML file. So we actually have to use, in this case, OneDrive first to create an HTML file from the HTML we're passing it in. And then OneDrive can take that HTML file, and it has a convert action. So it can actually convert that to PDF or to a PDF in this case. So that's what we're doing. We inserted a OneDrive create file option, and I just created a folder on my OneDrive for PowerApps. And for the file name, I'm asking for that name from my Power App. So I went over here and said ask in PowerApps. And for the file content, I do the same thing. I ask in PowerApps and I pass it in the HTML data. For the file name, make sure that you put in the .html or else this won't work. So make sure that that's there when you're using that. And then we just use the convert file action. And when you click into the file, it's going to give you all the properties from your create file that we just did up here. And just select the ID so that it knows which file to get and tell it what you want to convert it to. So in this case, it's a PDF. And now I don't want to keep these files in my OneDrive. I want them to be stored out on a SharePoint site so that my team members can access it. So what I'm doing now is using a SharePoint create file action, passing in the address of my sales portal site. I'm getting the folder path for where I want it to go. So there's just a shared documents library out there. And for the file name, I'm just using that same ask in PowerApps, because you remember how back here, when I called my flow, I passed it in this data card value 12 text contact info. That's the name of my file. So I want to get that from PowerApps. And make sure, again, for the file name, you put a dot in whatever the type of file it is. So in this case, it's a PDF that we had just converted it to. And for the file content, that will be the file content here from the convert file action. So just select that and fill that in. Now we are responding back to PowerApps, and I want to put the link to the file back out. So what you can do is just copy the URL of your SharePoint site where that's at, and just put in the path from your create file action. So you'll see that we have this create file too, and one of the options here is path. So that'll get the actual name of the library in the physical file there. So we have a fully qualified URL. So let's just see if this works as expected. If we go back to our Power App, if I click that download button, see a little kind of dots at the top. That means that the flow is running. Great. So now I have this message letting me know success. I can click here to view or print. And that is what my PDF file will look like. Again, I kept it really simple. If you are an HTML guru, you can make this look really nice and spiffy, but from here I could go and just print this out and I have a printable file from PowerApps.
That's really cool, April.
Yeah.
We do have another question. Christopher's wondering, when you create a file in SharePoint, can you add any metadata to that file?
Yes, so in the, well, not in the create file action. So the create file action and flow just creates the physical file. So what you'd have to do if I needed to apply metadata to this particular file is insert another action. So it's kind of a two-step process in flow, right? In SharePoint, and there's an update file properties. Yeah, there you go. So just go down to the bottom here, you'll select the update file properties, point that to your site address and the library for where that is that you want to update. And for the ID, just use the ID of the file you just created. And then once you do that, you'll notice that you have all the properties available. In my case, I just have a title field, but now I would be able to go in and fill out like the title metadata for that particular file. Great question. Anything else before I move on?
Yep, April, follow up to that one. What would happen if the metadata was required? Would it not save the document?
Well, that's a great question. I believe if it's required, it would show up here in the create file because it's a dependency, so it would make you fill that out. So right now I don't have title required on this, so it doesn't show, but I think in the create file, if it's required, it'll show. So the update file properties is only for non-required metadata that you want to go back in and fill out. I'm doubting myself and I could be wrong on that, but I believe that's how it works. Don't quote me on that if I'm wrong. I've just actually never tried that. So. All right, and if we have time at the end, I'll just run through that and verify that after we get through the rest of the stuff. All right. So integration number 3 that I want to talk about, mass importing data. So this one's kind of cool. It actually came up for a particular customer to see if this is something that's possible. So with using PowerApps and Flow together, you can actually allow a user to upload an Excel file through PowerApps as a SharePoint attachment and kick off a flow that will move that attachment to a SharePoint document library. You can use the Microsoft Excel connector to parse the data, and you can add that data to your database, whether that's a SharePoint list or, in my case, a SQL, Azure SQL database. So I actually just worked on this and got it working, so I figured I'd throw it into the demo because it's a pretty cool use case. There is a trick, something to know about the Excel connector. You can't, out of the box, dynamically set the name of the file that you want it to look through and find the list rows for. So thankfully, when I was working on this, John Liu came to my rescue and he had a workaround where you can use the SharePoint HTTP trigger and get the appropriate ID it's expecting so that you can dynamically pass that in. And that'll make more sense as we look at this demo, but definitely reference his blog here on how to do this if this is something that you want to do at your work or just test out. Okay. So from the PowerApps side of things, this was what I wanted to hide to admins only. So if I click on the admin login here, and I'll just show you the backend screen here. I have a screen for mass or bulk upload, we'll call it. So now right now with PowerApps, you can't add to a SharePoint document library. So it's limited to adding as an attachment. So what you'll have to do is take a SharePoint list, add it as a data source in your app, which I did. I have a SharePoint list out here called, the data sources will load, contact imports. So that's just a SharePoint list. And I surface that up in my Power App as a form control. And I make sure to show the attachment field so that the user can attach a file. For the title, I'm just dynamically setting that to the current user's name and a unique GUID so that the file name's always different, because PowerApps is a native GUID function that will generate a unique GUID for you. Okay, so I want the user to be able to click attachment, upload a file, and then when they click the check mark, this is where I'm going to call the flow. And this flow will do everything. It will check that the file has been added as the attachment. It'll take the attachment, move it to a SharePoint document library, because with the Excel connector, you can't read from attachments. You can only read from document libraries. The Excel connector will look at it, get the data, look through all the rows of the data, and it will add it to the database. So I'm doing the same thing that you've been seeing me do to call this flow. I want to get the status of whether this was successful. So I'm doing a status variable, and I'm calling my flow, and I'm just passing it in the ID of the last submitted form, so I know which attachment to get. And then I'm just refreshing my data source. All right, so from the flow perspective, go back to my flows. I have a SQL mass import flow. And the first thing I'm doing is getting the attachment item from SharePoint. So just put in your list name. I'm getting the ID from PowerApps, what we just saw that I passed in. And then you have to, that gets the physical item, but now we need to get the attachments, because you know in SharePoint list, you can have multiple attachments. So we need to insert a get attachments action, pass in the ID from our get item here. And since there can be multiple attachments, we need to do an apply to each and loop through each of those attachments and get the attachment content. So if you insert and apply to each action here, the output will be your get attachments body. So that'll be the only option that'll show here. So you'll click that, put that in your apply to each output. Then we need to insert, there's a separate action called get attachment content. So within our apply to each, we just do our site address, our list name. For the ID, it's going to be the ID from your get item, and the file identifier is going to be the ID from your get attachments ID here. Okay. Now that we have the attachment, we're going to create a file in a SharePoint document library of that attachment, so the Excel connector can do all its magic. So I just have a shared document library out there. I'm just taking the title from the item in the SharePoint attachment list, and I'm getting the attachment content from the get attachment content action. Okay. All right, so that's going to do that for each of these attachments. In my case, I'm only ever going to have one attachment per item, so I don't need to handle the multiple attachments and all that. So here's where the piece that comes into play to make this whole Excel connector thing work, since we can't dynamically pass it in the URL. We have to insert another one of those SharePoint send HTTP request actions. Again, put in your site address, your method, which is going to be a get, and here is the URI. And again, just reference John Liu's blog post on this for exactly how to make this work. In my case, I'm just passing in the name of my file, .xlsx. So this is going to get the unique ID for that file. Now we need to just put this result of this out into a compose. So now here's where all the, I guess the magic is happening per se, and this is in the Excel functions. So a couple things about this Excel to note. There are some limitations about how many rows that it can read through. I believe that's 250 rows max that it can loop through. So just be aware of that ahead of time. That's not an issue in my case because I'm never going to be importing that many at a particular time. I think you can up it, but it's just more, make it slower and just more cumbersome to do. But you got to do 3 different things with Excel. One, you need to get the physical worksheet. So that is in the document library on my sales portal. And the file is this from the compose where we did the HTTP action there. Once you have the worksheet, this is reliant on the data being stored in a table in your Excel. So it has to be formatted as a table. So since the Excel worksheets can have multiple tables. You need to point it to the table that you want to reference. So again, that's in our compose. And then now is where we can finally list the rows present in the table. So this action is actually going to go through the table that we've defined and loop through all the rows and put that in an array for us. So now that we have all of those row data, we need to do a for each. So for every row data that it finds, so from this list rows present in the table, we're going to insert a row into SQL. So like I said, in my case, I'm using Azure SQL. So you can connect with that through Flow. If this was SharePoint, you would just do SharePoint create item action if you wanted to add this to a SharePoint list instead. But once you do that, you just point it to your table name or your list name if you're using SharePoint, and you just map the properties. So first name goes to first name in Excel, last name, and just map out all of your fields. And then we just respond back to PowerApps with the status. So just letting it know that it was finished. And that's basically how it works. So let's just test this out. All right, so I'm going to run my app. I'm going to attach a file. Let's see. And I just got to remember where my file is. That's the hard part. Okay, I believe it's this contact import test that I have. And I'll just show you real quick. Well, let's just upload it and we'll see if it works. How about that? I already lost it. I'm blind today. Sorry about that, guys. Oh, it's because I went to my desktop. All right. There we go. So that's the file that I want to upload that has data. So if I click this check mark, that's going to, like we just looked at, run the flow. And it should refresh my data and show me what was imported here on the right-hand side, which hopefully it works here. Oh, awesome. So it did. So you can see it just takes a little bit to run through, but here's the data that was imported. So this is pulling directly from my SQL table, and here are all the contacts that were imported. So pretty cool, right? And another little thing that I did just to make this usable, if you said click here to download the import template. So you need to make sure that your field names and everything are matched up correctly. So you want to provide your end users with a template that they use to do this mass uploading. So we just put this on the SharePoint site, and the users could download the template, paste in their data to the Excel, upload it to PowerApps, and because we already have it formatted as a table and we have all the column names set up correctly. So it just makes it easy for the end user to be able to download the table from the Power App itself, put in their data, re-upload it, and automatically have it added to your data source. All right, any questions on that? All right. Great, I think we're getting to the last one here. Okay, so last one, capture photos in Power Apps and push those to SharePoint document libraries. So this was, again, something that was a little tricky to do, right? The file format that the pictures are taken in Power Apps is, not really natively supported in SharePoint, so you had to do a lot of convoluted stuff to get the file in a format that's right to display correctly in SharePoint. Well, just recently, I think just last week, actually, there's this new JSON function that was released that makes capturing photos in Power Apps and pushing those to SharePoint much easier. So you can easily convert your images to JSON and call a flow that parses that JSON and adds the file in SharePoint for you. So that's the last thing that I want to walk through and demo for you guys. And in this particular demo, I'm going to be showing two different new features. So not only the JSON, but there's a new business card importer feature that's pretty cool. All right. So let me close out of that. So in my Power App here, you'll notice that I have this screen for BizCard Scanner. So this is using that new functionality. So this is actually pretty cool. It's using Azure Cognitive Services in the back end, but this is just a control that you could add to your app just as easily as you would adding a text input or a drop-down list. And if you click it, it'll open up a file explorer where you can find a picture of a business card. Sorry, I just gotta remember here. I have so many pictures on here, it's crazy. You know what? Let's find a picture of a business card. I think I used this one before on the internet here real quick. Yeah, that one's just funny. I don't know if there's any other Mad Men fans out there, but I like using this one as a example. Save that to my desktop. Okay. So let's do that again. Let's find our picture. So this is going to, again, like in the back end, it's doing all this calling cognitive services to look at the card and all that and get the data. But now if I click this checkbox, it's actually going to call a flow that will take the image, because you notice it gets a nice clean image of the card too. And this is adding the contact to a database, and it's adding the business card to SharePoint. So now if I click here, there's my scanned card on SharePoint. Bam, just that easy. Okay. Now if I close out of that, you'll see here's all the information that it found from the card. So I was able to tell his position, his phone number, and address all automatically. So it's pretty sweet functionality here. So let's just take a look first how it works. So in this, the AI piece itself is a preview feature, so you may or may not see this in your environment yet. But if you click on the Insert tab, you'll see this new AI Builder preview option. And one of the options here is the business card reader. So I just inserted one of those, and that's this control that you get here. And in this form, I'm just pointing it to my contacts list because I'm taking all the properties. So this just gives you let's insert a label and I'll show you here what I'm talking about. So you can reference the business card reader, this card scanner. And if you do a dot, these are all the properties that you can get from the scanner. So you can get the person's name, you know, all of that from the properties there, and fill it out with your data. All right, so let's look at the check mark, because this is where we're using the JSON. This is why it's really helpful. So all I'm doing right now is I'm first getting the image with this collect statement from the business card reader, okay? And I'm giving it a name. So I want it to be formatted as a JPEG, and I'm just applying a random name there. And now here's where the JSON bit comes into handy. So I'm setting a variable called JSON, and you just call the JSON function with JSON like that, pass in your image, which I just defined right here, and you just format the JSON to include binary data, so it's the right format for SharePoint. And lastly, I am doing a patch statement, so I have a contacts list out on SharePoint in this case. Well, this is SQL actually. So I'm taking all the data that the business card reader found, and I'm adding it to my database with a patch statement. So just mapping the first name property with what the business card reader got for first name and all those properties, and it's adding that to the database there. Here is where I'm executing the flow. So I have a flow called JSON to image, and I'm just passing in my JSON that I defined here, and I'm returning back the image link, which is in that pop-up that we just saw. So let's look at the flow. That's this JSON to image flow. So again, initiating from PowerApps, I'm just initializing a variable for the image link that I want to pass back to PowerApps there. And then we need to parse the JSON. So I'm getting the content I'm just asking in PowerApps, right? And then we need to do a schema. And it's going to expect that for the JSON. So the best, easiest way to do that is, let's see, I believe I have a label. If I set like a text input here, like just a label to that var JSON that I set, this is going to show me the JSON that was converted automatically for me. So I can just copy this and use that as my schema and my flow. So I can say use sample payload and paste in what I had from PowerApps there. So it's a nicely formatted JSON, so it knows what to look for when it's parsing. And then now that we have the JSON, we just got to loop through that. So loop through your parse JSON, and we are creating a file using the create file action. Oops, that's not good. And we're creating the file in SharePoint based on that JSON that we had there. Hopefully it'll take me back to the same screen. Yeah. Here we go. Again, so I have a business card folder in my shared documents. For the file name, I'm just getting the name from my parse JSON. And for the file content, this is the only extra bit that you have to do. You need to do an expression. So you need to do a data URI to binary expression function and pass in your picture from your parse JSON. And that will be in the correct format. And then we're just setting that variable of our image link that was just created, and we are responding back to PowerApps. So again, much more simple way. I'm sure if you go out onto YouTube and see the way that you used to have to do this, this is a much, even though it's still a couple steps, it's a much cleaner way of doing things with that new JSON. And that works not just for this business card scanner, but if you were to just insert a camera control or an image control, it's the same method. You convert it to use the JSON function, have a flow that does exactly what I just did there, and it'll add it to the SharePoint library for you. Okay.
Hey, April.
Yeah. Yep.
We've got a question from Steve who's watching online. He's wondering if that scan control supports different file types, such as PDF.
Yes, I believe it supports PDF, JPEG, PNG. I have to look at the documentation, but I know those three for sure. So as long as they can recognize it as a valid business card, yep, it'll support that. Great question. Yeah, so that's really, let's see. That's actually all I had as far as demos for this. So yeah, if there's any more questions, feel free to ask that, but this is how you can reach me. Again, I'm really active on Twitter, so that's always a good way. My LinkedIn, my blog. I have a YouTube channel, so some of the demos, like with the business card reader and stuff that I walk through, I actually have a video out on YouTube on that. And a lot of my PowerApps that I build, I will export and put them out on my GitHub there, so you can see some samples of how this works. So definitely check that out and just get some PowerApp samples too. Cool.
All right, thank you so much, April. Anybody who's watching online, if you have any questions, feel free to enter those in the questions panel or the chat panel. We'll be watching that for the next few minutes. Otherwise, thank you to everybody who's attending online and everybody in person. We're going to start, we have 2 more meetings in our regular monthly schedule, then we're going to start doing quarterly meetings in person, but we'll continue to do remote live streaming like this.
Great, yeah, thanks for having me.
right, several thank yous coming in for you, April, from people watching online. One person said they're looking forward to reviewing the recording, and that just reminded me that everybody who's registered for the webinar here is going to get an email with that recording. Everybody else can view it on YouTube in just a couple hours.
Great.
All right, April, we have a question here. So Anita's watching and says, great session, very helpful. Wondering if the OneDrive where you created the file is the user's OneDrive that's triggering the flow or the user that created the flow?
The user that created the flow. Yeah, that's another great question. So everything in flow runs in the context of the current user. So let's see, HTML PDF. So this is going to be connected to the person that created the flows OneDrive. So that's why a lot of times what people will do is they'll create these flows with like some kind of general service account, type thing, instead of someone's personal account, so that it's out there and so that person leaves and it doesn't accidentally get deleted. So it's generally what a lot of people do in that scenario, since it does run in the context of the current user that created it.
All right, that answered that question. I think we'll go ahead and close up here. So again, thank you to everybody who's online and joined us. And thank you so much, April, for sharing your knowledge and those cool demos. I always love to see those.
Yeah.
We hope we can have you again.
Yeah, no problem. Thanks for having me.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.